Thank you. I wonder if we could get speakers to come up, perhaps, and just sort of be with us here, so that we can, if we have questions. We have actually got quite a wee bit of time now for questions. Thank you, Clifton, for a very succinct and to the point presentation. We're leaving this slide up on the screen because it is the burning question. How should the management agency respond to that situation, which is a very, very nice little, to me, a nice little graphic of exactly what's happening. But we have here our four speakers. Renee's coming, yes. And we also have members here of the AFB Pest Management Board here, and it's now open to you people to ask questions according, as I said earlier on, please keep your questions succinct. We don't need a speech, we actually need a question. I see one hand there with Jane so far, and Russell and Roger, so that's a start. Yeah, we need to have use of the microphone. So, Jane, did you want to ask a question? Have you got a microphone? Guys need seats. You're right.
The question I would like to ask is, I know you have a policy and that on surveillance. Why have these beekeepers that you have done work on just recently that have had 10% cases, why have they not been picked up in the surveillance program previously in a timely manner?
That's a very good question. For two of these beekeepers, they have been known to have high levels of AFB for over 10 years. For one of them, they've had high levels of AFB for over 5 years. And I think the answer to that question is from November of this year, of last year I should say, we've taken a different approach. We are now looking for beekeepers that aren't managing their AFB. I think unfortunately what happened prior to November of last year is AP2 inspections were programmed on a set and forget basis, and if you contact a local epidemiologist as to how much inspections you actually need to do to find AFB, they will tell you that having the resource to inspect 2% of APRIs each year is nowhere near enough.
All right, thank you, Clifton. Russell, you have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask John of Gisborne. Your qPCR testing, we would like to audit our beekeeping operators. We'd like to be able to test samples of honey from each site. How far are you about achieving this so we can take a honey sample off the whole yard, and what would the cost be?
So one of the advantages with qPCR over things like culture, we can test lots of different samples. And in fact, if it's a sample you believe AFB could be present, whether it's soil, whether it's wax, then once we work out a protocol to get the DNA out, we can test it for American foulbrood. And for a lot of different samples, which I didn't mention, but it's on our poster, we've developed protocols for wax, for woodware, for bee debris, for floor sweepings, for lots of different samples. So honey is one of the easier ones to test for American foulbrood. And one of the reasons why we developed the kit that I mentioned at the end for use in other laboratories, there are a lot of honey DNA extractions being done for the Manuka honey testing. And we've used that protocol in our laboratory, and it also works extremely well for extracting American foulbrood DNA from honey. So that's why we kitted it up. We do it in our laboratory, but it means other laboratories who are doing the DNA extractions anyway can also test for American foulbrood. Cost-wise, Russell, about $80 for a honey sample. One of the things we can't do though, if we composite lots of honey samples together, we're going to get one CQ. We're going to get one level of American foulbrood present. So how the samples are composited is really going to be up to the individual beekeepers as to whether they do it by apiary or quarantine hives versus clean hives. So that's something that's outside the control of the testing laboratory. Thanks, Russell.
I think it comes down, from what I'm hearing John saying, it comes down to, okay, you get a result, what does it mean? And how do you actually translate that out into whether or not you've got a risk going on in your colony? So there's a lot of work to be done in that area, but it's exciting. Roger.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's no difference between a single hive of a hobbyist beekeeper with AFB and one of 40 to 60,000 hives that a large commercial beekeeping operation might have one hive of AFB in their operation. What has happened, I believe, within the management agency is that they've taken a direction that they will destroy all gear suspected to belong to harbour AFB. Now, if a large commercial outfit has some sort of ongoing, even under 10% occurrence of AFB, they're still harbouring AFB. So perhaps we want to know if the agency are planning on putting any controls on these people who have maybe under 10%, because that's the real kicker. These people are transferring AFB all around the show.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Clifton, do you want to take that one? Okay.
So in terms of the 10%, it's not 10% of AFB as in if you're a beekeeper that's unfortunate enough to have 10% of AFB, of your hives with AFB, and you are inspecting your hives, reporting them to the management agency and destroying them. While your level of AFB is higher than desirable, you are not currently a priority for us. The beekeepers that we are interested in have got more than 10% AFB, and yet for the last 3 years the numbers of AFB notifications to the management agency has been 0 or 1 case in the last 3 years, and yet we go in there and find hundreds. Those are the beekeepers that we are interested in, and because they are clearly not managing their AFB. With respect to Roger's comment, with these highly non-compliant beekeepers, there are 2 things going on. One is there is a failure of their inspection program. The other thing is many of them, but not all, are preoccupied with recycling infected gear. And you don't get up to 30% AFB overnight. It's taken quite a long time to get there, and you've got old gear that's been used multiple times. You haven't delivered on the traceability requirements of your DECA, so we can't actually tell which gear's which, and often these beekeepers are taking the honey off before we've found the AFB, so we know all of that gear that was associated with the honey is infected. And when we're issuing directions to destroy, regrettably what we are doing is we are directing the beekeeper to do what any reasonable beekeeper would have already done without directions. So yeah, we shouldn't be needing to issue directions to destroy gear, because any responsible beekeeper would have already destroyed it, and they sure as hell wouldn't have left it hidden or in piles for the neighbourhood bees to rob.
Thank you. Yes, we had a question down here, John, and I think you have one too. Okay, and John, we've got a mic there behind you. And then Barry.
Has there been consideration to having the AFB board elected rather than appointed?
Can anybody answer that? Somebody from the board? Yep.
Firstly, they're not appointed. There's a set process for which is Russell. It's to the management agency, but everybody else goes through the process of selection, an independent selection, so it's conducted by an independent organisation to ensure that we get the right calibre of people to the board.
Okay, Barry.
Oh, I'd just like to ask a question about quarantining of apiaries, and probably really looking at, say, the two middle categories in your categories of beekeepers there. When you find AFB, it's recommended that you quarantine your apiaries, but nowadays, obviously with the commercial pressures on there, I'm seeing as an AP2, apiaries that have had AFB, those might have been burnt, moved into the likes of kiwi fruit pollination. So I was wondering if the board could look at some ways of going a little bit beyond recommendation to perhaps a bit closer enforcement of quarantine.
Marco, you want to look at that one? Thank you.
In reality, we have the powers to enforce even the way that you manage your bees, if that is required. In one of those case studies, we actually issue a restricted place notice to the affected beekeeper for his entire operation. So he's only allowed to move any gear that has a risk of transferring AFB with a written permit from the AFB management agency. So we have the tools to use it, but we only use it when it's basically required. Yes, we try to work with the beekeeper, and we will only take those measures in extreme cases.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I can think of the question with regards to that group in there are often situations where a little bit of help is all that's needed to bring them into the willing and able group. I think about the recidivist group myself in terms of the carrot and the stick situation, with the donkey with the carrot hanging on the end of a stick, and you can feed as many carrots as you like to a donkey. Sooner or later you have to use the stick to actually get him to move. Neil.
There's been a great talk about a lack of resources or money. Has there been any helicopter surveillance? From memory, last year there was, or a year before, and there was 40% unregistered hives, because must be a lot of revenue out there. And also, have you ever done checks on flights on helicopters delivering hives around in the bush in Manuka? Because my understanding is that it's those sites are not being registered, and it should be for harvesting. That those honey should be where the honey is harvested, not where it's produced, not where it's harvested in a big site. So is that being checked? Because that might be a revenue income.
So no, we haven't done helicopter surveillance since autumn of last year. In terms, in the final wash-up of that, the level of unregistered apiaries wasn't as high as it looked. Part of what was happening there were a large number of apiaries with incorrect XY coordinates, and we know and appreciate that ApiWeb is not easy for beekeepers to use, and it is easy for you to make a mistake with your XY coordinates. So that was a large part of the problem. In terms of why we haven't done any helicopter surveillance this year, we've decided to prioritise AFB, and in particular beekeepers that have had high levels of AFB. When we do run an enforcement operation, myself and Marco do end up under the microscope out the other end, and so many of you may think that the job is done and dusted after the AP2s have finished their work, but from my point of view, my work's just beginning at that point, unfortunately. So we've made a very conscious decision to prioritise AFB, and because at the end of the day, what we're here for is to eliminate AFB. We do have a shortage of resources, and what we're trying to work towards is there are lots of things that could be done to eliminate AFB, and we are doing our best to focus on the highest priority, the most important things that will make a big difference. And on your question of effectively auditing helicopter flights, I was told yesterday that Rex did organise that through his contacts in civil aviation, and there's definitely something that we can pick up in the future.
Any further questions? Yeah. Yes, sir. Jane, is it? Yes. Anybody else? Sorry.
Right. We applaud you in that for doing these inspections and that to get rid of clinical American flower brood. But you're saying you're also then giving notice of direction for people to actually destroy their associated equipment. It's very unclear to me exactly how much testing you actually do on that associated equipment and what legislation you are doing to actually verify the destruction of that associated equipment.
So, first and foremost, we're making the decision based on the clinical situation on the ground. How much AFB are we actually finding in the hives? What is the management practices of those of the beekeepers affected? So that's the primary side of things. We do some laboratory testing, but to be quite honest, that laboratory testing is to confirm what we already know as kind of a final check. And in terms of how we are working under the National American Foulbrood Pest Management Plan. Clause 6 of the National Pest Management Plan says that the management agency is to implement the plan, and Clause 8 of the Pest Management Plan specifies the Biosecurity Act powers available to the management agency to do that implementation.
My understanding is, though, that the pest management plan is only for beekeepers to destroy clinical symptoms. You are going beyond clinical symptoms to subclinical, and you aren't actually checking every piece of equipment. So those beekeepers should not actually have to destroy that equipment that may harbour AFB. We think that you should actually still allow people to contract somebody to actually sterilise equipment so that those beekeepers can still actually continue their beekeeping operation. For some of these people and that, it would appear...
Jane, do you have a question in that respect? You're asking whether that can be done? We've got really time left.
Well, so you're using the Biosecurity Act for eliminating that equipment?
We're using the powers under the Biosecurity Act that are specified in the Pest Management Plan.
So under the Biosecurity Act, I understand compensation would be payable to those beekeepers that you were forced to destroy equipment?
We're using the powers specified under the National Pest Management Plan. No compensation is payable. The other thing that's really important, even if you're doing things under the Biosecurity Act alone, there is no compensation payable for beekeepers that have broken the law. And all of these beekeepers have broken the law and aren't eligible for compensation, and the extent of that is that if small hive beetle turned up tomorrow and it happened to be in one of their patches, MPI would be perfectly in their rights to pay no compensation for whatever happened in the small hive beetle response. So we're talking about people who have broken the law here, and I'd be quite happy to put to a show of hands in terms of a beekeeper that's got 30% AFB and they've had AFB for a long period of time and they haven't been destroying their affected gear. Who here thinks that that gear should be destroyed, and who here thinks it should be left? Could I have a show of hands for who thinks the gear should be destroyed?
A couple of those people in that you said have had disease for quite some time.
Yeah, they have.
And they should have been picked up earlier on.
We have to carry on, but we're nearly close on time. I think Cameron? Oh, John.
Sorry, just to address Jane's point of view about the risk. So some of the things that we've worked on are things like floor sweepings from some operations. And imagine if you had ropey larvae and you'd think that's really high risk if I just left that out for bees. So imagine taking that ropey larvae and multiplying it by 20,000 and just having it spread over your floor. And so with the quantitative PCR, we can really get a sense of, are we detecting a low-level amount on the floor of this operation, where they might be scraping frames or whatever, or are there levels that, for a lump of wax or a bit of bee debris, does it equate to what we'd see in the millions of spores in a ropey larvae? And so in some of these instances where we've tested, it's the ones where we, it's not very scientific, but we get the heebie-jeebies down our back, because essentially in these lumps of wax from floor sweepings, there's what we'd call clinical levels of AFB. It's the same as a clinical ropey larvae. So in some of this debris, we're seeing massive amounts of American foulbrood. Is it clinical? Is it ropey larvae? No. But the amount of spore DNA present is massive.
Frank, do you have a question? Yeah, thank you. I think probably the science is going to answer the question. Pardon? Yes, we have. We've got an extra 5 minutes. What we did have was a summary at the end, but we're prepared to put that into the questions because there's some good questions coming through.
I'm not a beekeeper, but I have a question which may help many beekeepers dealing with American firewood. And this is all about a kind of strategy, what to do when you have a non-clinical kind of situation in your apiary, and what to do, and what is the best strategy to deal with a non-clinical situation. Or, which is related, there is a second question. If you have a clinical hive in an apiary, like 20 hives, what to do with the rest of the apiaries in the same, the other hives in the same apiary. So can you give us guidance for such situation?
Very good. So basically your questions are all answered in the Yellow Book. Most of you guys will have a copy of the Yellow Book, so it's very simple principles. Subclinical situations, keep inspecting. If the beehive is clean before harvesting the honey, extract the honey. So by removing that honey from that hive, basically you are purging any residual AFB loads that may be in those honey supers. For an apiary site where you got an AFB case, then basically we expect you to carry out a site quarantine. Increase your frequency of inspections and try to check your traceability records to try to see if that infected hive that you find on site has shared any piece of equipment with any other beehives within that apiary site or with any other apiaries that you own. Keep doing that for 2 years, and if after 2 years, basically it doesn't show up as AFB, clinical signs of AFB, that means that that apiary is not longer at risk of developing AFB from that previous AFB incident. But it could still get it from the neighbor. Yeah.
Jason, yeah. Thank you, Jason.
We run our commercial operation in Hawke's Bay. About 5 years ago, we had about 36 cases of AFB. We have the ability to paraffin dip our savable hiveware. When it first started, we chose not to do that, so the minute we found a clinical AFB, everything was destroyed. All yards were put into quarantine. And what we found, if we found one AFB in a yard, we generally found 2 more in that yard. We still use those and they were destroyed. The remaining hives, we still produced honey from them, but those boxes were tracked and traced. We had a very strict quarantine process, and it took 3 years to come out the other end of that, and now all of those apiaries are AFB free, and so that track and trace is really, really important, and that's what saved us. But also the paraffin dipping, we opted not to do that. We just destroyed, and it obviously worked for us.
Yes, I can quote another case from down our way where a beekeeper bought some equipment from a beekeeper who dropped out, basically. He made a whole lot of nukes. He ended up with 30% infection in his 500 hives. He got some advice from, at that stage, an apiculture advisor. He gave him a plan to work to. It was a 3-year process, just like you talked about, James. It was worked on the basis of you don't put any suspect material on a site that is any better than having already had AFB. In other words, it was a staggered thing. In 3 years, he cleaned it up. He's now clean. But he took the advice and he asked for it and sought help. But he'd given himself a big problem, and those possibilities are out there. We're just right on out of time. I just want to perhaps, on your behalf, thank our panel here today very much for their contributions, our speakers in the first instance, for some interesting stuff. I think myself that the future that lies with the scientific side of things is quite exciting, and all we need to do is get some calibration, and we could actually have a slight change in the pest management strategy sometime in the future based upon that kind of good science. For the panel, fine, thank you. We're not taking any more questions, so we have to wrap up now because our next speaker is due on in about right now. So I have to wrap it up now. Thank you very much for your participation and for your, shall I say... Well, I'm sorry, Russell, we haven't got time at the moment. I'm sorry. Do you have somebody you can address it to? Oh, well, okay. If our next speaker has generously given you a little bit of time. Yeah, he's saying it's better be a good question, Russell.
Us commercial beekeepers are pretty worried. We have been keeping our disease level down. We believe we are abiding by the law. But I guarantee, and our disease level is a lot lower now than it was. I guarantee if you look through our 50,000 boxes that you'd find some AFB spores in there. I want your assurance that you're not going to burn our 50,000 boxes. We're at great risk at the moment.
Yeah, having AFB spores.
If the bank manager heard we're going to lose all our boxes,
right. I don't think
we got a problem.
Anyway.
So, Russell, providing you're doing the good job of managing AFB that you're describing of, we've got no intention of burning your boxes. We've got higher priorities in terms of the beekeepers that have got high levels of unmanaged disease, and that's where we're focused. We know and understand that beekeepers can be doing the right thing, and you can have a few cases of AFB, and you can be doing close to the right thing, and you can have a few more. That's not our priority. Our priority is the beekeepers that have got large amounts of AFB, and as you saw from Marco's presentation, our AP2s were finding 23 to 57% undiagnosed AFB. A beekeeper that we happen to turn up, inspect their hives, and we find 3% AFB, yeah, that's more than you should have, but it's not a priority for us.
Thank you for your assurance.
Let me just also tell one of the beekeepers who were subject to these enforcement actions, he asked me why you are not doing the same for this commercial beekeeper who reported 400 cases of AFB last year. Why do you do it to me if you only found 199 cases? And I said, the reason why is because that commercial beekeeper, yes, he reported that many AFB, but in percentages, it's less than 1%. But in your case, it's more than 50%. And that's what counts.
Russell, just to your comment as well, perhaps part of the concern is about the use of very sensitive DNA tools. And we've had other countries say, why are you looking for AFB by DNA? You're going to find it in every hive. You're going to find it everywhere. That's not the case. So the majority of instances where we look for AFB, we don't find it. The DNA is flatline. No DNA, no AFB detected. So it's not just because we're working with very sensitive tools, it's not a foregone conclusion that we will detect.
Thank you.